Nation in Conversation, proudly brought to you by AFGRI, Fort Knox, Hinterland, Monsanto, Nedbank, NWK and Senvis. Where jungles stood, great cities rise. On desert wasteland, new farmland lies. Where man aspired to rearrange, he dreamed a dream and made a change. His mind is such a shaping force.
Good day and welcome to Nation in Conversation from me, Theo Foster. At Nation in Conversation, we take a deeper look at the agriculture sector and the significance of this industry in our daily lives. You can follow us on Twitter at Nation Converse or visit our website, nationinconversation.co.za. Joining me in the studio today, Professor Ferdi Meyer, Director of the Bureau for Food and Agriculture Policy, BFAP, and Davie Rood, the Chief Economist at the Efficient Group. Ferdi, if we look at the agriculture sector over the last 10, 20, 30 years, there has been tremendous changes. A farm and a farmer today is not the same as a farm and a farmer 20, 30, 40 years ago. What has been the major changes?
Yeah, thanks, Theo. It's good to be here. I think let's just, if we talk in broad terms, let's just classify it as maybe, let's look at intensification versus expansion. And I think we have, if we look at, let's say we have got three major industries. We've got the horticulture industry, with the high value commodities. We have the livestock industry, and we have the field crops. So within these three big sectors, and you were referring to the primary industry. So let's just look at the primary, in other words, the producer level. We've had different trends coming, and where you typically had in your 60s and 70s, if we think about field crops. We had a rapid expansion with mechanization, rapid expansion in area planted under major field crops like maize and your wheat, etc. And this area grew, the total area in South Africa, under production it grew. Our yields didn't increase that fast. We had more an expansion of production under these field crops. The number of farmers was relatively stable until about the 80s. That's where we really saw the number of farming units declining, farms getting gradually bigger, but still we had the support from the marketing boards. We had the maize board, we had the wheat board, and those boards were basically setting a price similar to what we still have in some of the areas in the world, setting a price based on negotiations with the boards and looking at production costs. And the farmer knew basically at planting time which price he would get, he or she, and the area was growing. But then in the late 80s, that's when we saw the first drop in hectares. And it was basically a lot of these, the programs were too expensive to run this in a lot of these areas. We were pushing marginal hectares. We were moving into areas of production where it was just not competitive to grow internationally. And we were exporting these surpluses of grain at a loss. And this was becoming too expensive for the country. So they started with various initiatives, and our area of field crops started coming down. And we were producing in more the higher value areas, or the more productive areas, increasing our yields. And that's where the whole process of intensification started. And obviously then we knew the major shift came with the deregulation of the boards, completely open market, and suddenly you had to compete internationally with futures markets. There was no fixed price. It was an open market, trading import-export parity, and it really had to drive farmers to become far more productive. I think that's from a grains perspective or a field crop perspective. Horticulture, we had the opposite in the sense that the real fast growth and in other words, expansion and intensification. In other words, we saw more hectares and higher yields coming only after the deregulation of the markets, where our international markets opened up. South Africa could export our fruits and our wine, and we really saw an expansion. Exactly the opposite in terms of expansion, and where we had a contraction in the hectares of grains, we had an expansion in fruits. Livestock was expanding all the time as our consumers were earning more. So in other words, a higher income per capita, and it pushed into a higher income bracket where you could actually afford more protein, animal proteins, etc. So that's in very broad terms the story.
Clearly, our farmers had to start to compete internationally. The markets were open and they competed with farmers around the world. In order to remain competitive, what do you need to do?
Well, I'm not an agricultural economist. I'm a macroeconomist, and I look at agriculture slightly different. And I try to look at agriculture exactly the same as I look at other industries. And if I can add on to what Faris just said, is that I see more from a philosophical point what has happened to agriculture and what is happening to the South African farmer. Agriculture, in a way, used to be like mining, a primary industry, and let's call it a dirty industry, because that's what you start your production processes. From there, you go to value add in the manufacturing industry, and eventually you go to other industries in your economy. And in a way, agriculture has moved from a dirty industry, from a primary industry, to a service industry. And I think South Africa has done it excellently. What I mean with the service industry is that the real value add in agriculture today, of course, land is still there and you need everything, but the real value add is in things like, for example, genetics. And genetics is nothing but a typical service industry item, if one can, or something else like, for example, management, or something else like the way that you manage your personnel. So in a way, I see agriculture moved from a primary industry to a large extent to a service industry. Secondly, what I've noticed as well is that two major changes took place in agriculture the last couple of years, the last couple of decades. The first one is the land is exactly the same. Of course, agricultural economists will disagree with me on certain things, I'm sure. But from my point of view, land is exactly the same. But two major changes took place. The one is in technology. We had this massive leap in technology. And secondly, in skills in agriculture. And I think the South African farmer did absolutely amazing. The South African farmer really adapted very, very well to the challenges as far as technology is concerned. The South African farmer, and I'm sure Ferry can add much more to this than me, is really an excellent farmer on actually very low quality agricultural land to a large extent in South Africa. And I think the South African farmer really coped quite well. In a way, I also believe that the change in politics in South Africa, the change in the agricultural boards, as an example, forced many farmers in South Africa to become really competitive internationally. In the process, we lost a lot of farmers. There are far fewer farmers today. They're much bigger, much more technologically focused, and I also believe much more competitive than what we saw in South Africa, say, 20 or 30 years ago.
From a macro point, what is the role of agriculture in our economy, if you look at it from a macro point purely?
Yeah. Well, economists, tend to classify things, and that is sometimes incorrect. Because if you look at if you look at agriculture in the South African economy, it is actually a tiny part of the South African economy.
You simply look at the GDP numbers.
If you only the
part.
contribution to GDP, but that is incorrect, because you cannot split the different sectors in economy and say, listen, you can take this one out and the rest will survive, because they cannot survive. Everything in the economy, in all economies, it really depends on everything else in the economy. So the basic contribution of agriculture to the South African economy is in the region of about 3% or so. But the total value add starting in agriculture is significantly more than only the basic contribution to GDP.
After the break, I'd like to focus on the challenges and how we see the way forward. Nation in Conversation will be back in a moment. Welcome back to Nation in Conversation. Today we talk about the agriculture sector, primary agriculture and food security. Ferdi, what are the big challenges facing farmers today, if you look at the environment?
Theo, I would say, David touched on the global competitiveness of our farmers, and that's, in essence, that's at the heart of the whole story. We need to reinvest. To remain competitive, you have to reinvest in technology, and you have to reinvest in infrastructure, and that's really the biggest challenge that we currently have. Do we have the certainty? Do we have the environment, the environment that we need to reinvest in agriculture to maintain our competitiveness internationally? So we've had it, and I think we still have it. Our farmers can still compete, but there seems to be a trend that we're picking up. If you carefully look at capital formation in the agriculture sector. It seems to be not following the trend that we've had in the past of following net farming income. In other words, the positive growth that we've had in real net farming income due to this high commodity cycle. We don't see the level of capital formation than what we've had in the past. The data is a bit, you can make question marks around it, but that's the indication that we're getting. So overall, I think just maintaining our competitiveness, and that requires long-term fundamental investment in your operation.
The theme of the lack of investment, that's also a broad theme in the South African economy.
Without a doubt. And when you talk about lack of investment, an excellent example is, of course, Eskom. Eskom, and I've done the calculations, because we have a lack of electricity, the South African economy is probably losing lost production in excess of 300 billion rand annually. This economy would have been at least 10% larger than what it is if we had sufficient electricity. So that's an example of a lack of investment. In fact, that's an example of a lack of infrastructural investment. But that's not the only example of challenges that the South African farmer is facing at the moment. I get the opportunity to speak to South African farmers all the time. And the single biggest challenge, or the single biggest question mark in farming today is politics. What is the political situation?
Uncertainty.
Uncertainty about policy. And we have a government that is, and you can see it in all sorts of policies in South Africa, that is ideologically confused. And you see that in contradictory policies. And certainly as far as agriculture is concerned. You get a president telling in Davos foreigners to come and invest in South Africa, and the moment he's here, he says exactly the opposite as an example. You get rumors about 12,000 hectares, you get rumors about not allowing to buy land. Those sort of uncertainties is really undermining all sectors in the economy as well as agriculture. And for some reason, farmers is really made the scapegoat of just about everything in the South African economy.
Poor 30 or 40,000 farmers today almost picks up the slack of the 300-400 years.
And what I also noticed, and I'm sure Ferry, in fact, he just mentioned that to an extent, and that is that South African farmers, and they are very, very excellently skilled farmers in South Africa. They take their skills and their capital away. Let me put it to you differently. I know farmers that exported their farms. And how do you export a farm? You take your skills, you take your capital, you take your technology, and you go and buy a farm in Australia, for example. You establish a production unit in Australia, and you export to exactly the same customers in Europe. So what's changed? Only the production unit moved from South Africa to Australia. Who is actually losing here and who's gaining? South Africa is the big loser because of political uncertainty.
Ferdi, I want to raise another point. We talk about the commercial farmers in South Africa, which are from a yield perspective, from a profitability perspective, from a technology perspective, can compete with the best in the world. Then you have a big sector of traditional rural farmers. And there's a massive yield gap between these two sectors. Is there opportunity in that yield gap, and how should one go about to try to address that yield gap?
Oh, goodness, Theo, that's a good question. So, I mean, just in the statistics, they tell the story, but there's so much behind it. So if we just broadly speaking, let's say total agriculture or maize, let's just look at maize, because we have a lot of the informal farmers producing for themselves, the subsistence growers. Their yields are in the range of, let's say, 1.5, 2 tons per hectare. The ones that are not, we don't see these support programs. There are some development programs where they're linked into a chain, where they have access to better technology. But in essence, if you're a smallholder farmer, you just don't have the ability to access the level of technology and skills and mechanization that you need to have access to in order to can compete. Whereas your commercial guys, they're going for 4.5, 5 tons average, let's say, for the country. It's higher in the more higher production areas. But in essence, you need to look at, and this comes back to the whole argument of farm size structure and your farm size, this whole inverse relationship. We just had another conference again in Italy where the agriculture economists, finally the academic side of the agricultural economists realized, they said, yes, no, but maybe we were wrong, that the smallholder farmers, there is something about big farms and becoming more efficient. And it's all about the data and what you do with it. But in essence, I think it's a cultural issue. It's it's a system, I think, that we don't understand quite well yet in terms of if you don't have security of your farm, you own it. Are you on traditional land? And what are you farming for? What's the purpose of your farm? Is it just to create your own income for household food security? Well, that's one thing. But if we want to create smallholder farmers and leave them there with maize production, we know we're going to leave them in poverty. They cannot compete. And if you just look at the return for a household, it's just, you have to go in higher value commodities if you're looking at smallholder farmers.
Davy, underlying to this, the whole system, that the financial system, the banking system, input finance system, is based on ownership, on security of tenure.
And unfortunately, it's still based on the individual to a large extent. And I think what Ferry just referred to, the difference between the subsistence farmer and the commercial farmer, is an example of the ideological confusion of our government, because the president told us he's going to create 1 million jobs in agriculture. That will not happen. Nowhere in the world are farms getting smaller. Everywhere in the world they are getting bigger.
And less labor intensive.
And nowhere in the world are we employing more people. Everywhere in the world farms are employing fewer people. And the business model that we have in South Africa, and I think we've made a lot of progress in agriculture, but the business model is an outdated business model.
It's a historical business model.
It is. You've got an individual. That individual owns the land. And of course, private ownership is of the utmost importance. But the point is, private ownership vests in the individual. He is in charge of everything. He's the mechanic, and he's the farmer, and he's the personnel manager, and he's everything, and that is wrong. We need to change that and to realize that farming is not an individual business anymore. But at the root of all of this, the real basis that you need is private ownership. Not necessarily in the individual, but certainly it must vest in a corporate, and it must be private ownership and not public ownership of land.
Underlying should be an asset that
Without
can
a doubt.
be used in a financial system as security, as trade asset, but it needs to be an asset.
That must be private. Private ownership is the basis of any free economy. And I'm afraid that is under attack at the moment in South Africa.
After the break, I'd like to focus on the future. Please stay tuned in. Nation in Conversation will be back in a moment. Welcome back. This is Nation in Conversation. Ferdy, I would like to start by this section by focusing on the future. If you look the next 5, 10, 15 years, the major challenges, and how will the sector have to adapt to those challenges?
Yeah, Theo, I think we already mentioned the political uncertainty. That's a major challenge. I think we have to live with it, and we have to convince policy making that we need that certainty. So let's assume we have that certainty in the environment, and we need to grow. We need to feed the nation. I think our agriculture sector is geared to comfortably meet the demand growth in our local economy. And by that imply not only, it doesn't mean that we have to produce everything ourselves. We can import. There's nothing wrong with it. We can import. It just needs to be in an efficient supply chain. So we need to keep the investment going in our supply chains, that we can have the food in the retail stores, on the plates, as cost effective as possible. That implies we focus on the production areas where we have the competitive advantage. We drive those areas. We expand the areas that we can focus on, where we are competitive, and we import the other products where we don't have the competitiveness. And that's the key principle going forward. But again, coming back, we need to invest, and we need a political certainty to maintain this competitiveness.
A couple of other trends that I've picked up. The reality is that people are urbanizing. People are moving to cities. They're moving away from the rural areas. So to try to emphasize subsistence farming, for example, is not a very clever idea, because that is against the trend, firstly. Secondly, we have to realize that technology is, what's going to happen to technology in the future, it's difficult to comprehend what it's going to look like in the future, but what I'm very sure about, it's going to look completely different from what it is today.
And it will play a major role.
And it will increase productivity dramatically in the future. So realize that, and make sure that you're geared to capitalize on these new forms of technology. I also believe, except maybe for here and there, smallish farmers that fill a specific niche, but in future, farms are probably going to be massive, big corporates. There's going to be massive specialization within these corporates. Farms will probably rent or own large tracts of land. If you want to be a farmer in future, you will go and study to be a farmer, and you will go and manage a farm for a big corporate somewhere. Ownership will not be necessarily only local. It will not be an individual. It could be international ownership.
Do you foresee that the split between ownership and the farming entity, that you will have on the one hand an investor and then an operational company?
And that's exactly what it should be, because farming is gradually moving into becoming a modern economy. And that's what farming is going to look like. You will have investors not even buying into a farm, but buying into some sort of listed entity somewhere. Something that I've noticed that I think where the farming industry is a little bit lagging behind, and that is on finance. Apart from the fact that you still have the traditional, mostly, the traditional farming model in South Africa, the model that's been going for the past 100 years, the individual doing everything. The individual still goes to the bank, borrows money from the bank to buy his input, he will harvest and he will repay the bank. That's a relatively outdated form of funding a business. What we're probably going to see in future is that these big corporates will go to the capital market, to the bond market, and fund in the bond market.
Raise primary funding.
Those instruments will be properly listed instruments. And I think a discussion like what we are having today about agriculture, we will not have a discussion like this in future, because agriculture will be just another manufacturing industry.
Bertie, the skill set that this professional operator, let's call the farmer, the guy that operates the farming entity, the production entity, what will the skill set require from that guy?
Yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned skills. This week I was in Zambia, and I asked the commercial community there, what would it take for Zambia to really fill the space of becoming this grain basket of Southern Africa? And that was his answer, saying we don't have enough skills. We can import some of the skills went across the border from Zimbabwe, and some of them coming from South Africa, moving into Zambia and looking for alternatives. But I mean, the skill set, and I know Darby already alluded to it, I mean, you have to have a person that has this investment mind. And it's a
return on capital.
Return on capital, and you know, if you look at the university, also at the programs, it's integrated, it's multidisciplinary programs. It's a manager, it's a person who has a much wider skill set, understanding something about biological cycles all the way through the economic principles, and getting much stronger in terms of finance. And obviously your ability to see technology move, and actually to adopt technology and to incorporate technology in your farming business. And that's easier said than done. So I've seen it also in our operation. You see these things happening, but there needs to be a threshold where you have a certain size. So size is important. You need to have the economies of scale, and you need to have the ability to incorporate that type of technology on your farm on a day-to-day basis. And that's, as I said, that's a challenge. I think that's where the biggest challenge is.
Yeah, what I'm concerned about specifically about South Africa, about skills. We in South Africa, if you look at our policies that we follow, we're more interested in getting qualifications, but we're not very interested in getting skills. It's more important to get a certificate or a piece of paper, but it's not necessarily important to get some sort of skill that you can actually sell in the economy. And we produce 500,000 matrics every year. 70%, actually more than 70%, will not have a job in a year's time because they have a piece of paper, but they do not have the skills.
They do not have a skill that someone is willing to pay for. Shortly, your view, are you positive about the future, or do you see dark clouds?
I'm always positive. That's the way I see the world. There's always having a positive view. There are always opportunities. The bottom line is even if within this political uncertainty, I already see people being innovative and moving within the spaces that they can move in. But I am concerned about the level of long-term underlying fundamental investment in this industry.
What I can add to that is that the world is urbanizing. If people urbanize, they don't grow their own food anymore. And I'm talking about the world is a village. I'm talking about the Chinese and the Indians. We are going to see billions of people coming to the market. They're all going to be hungry.
Thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen. Please join the conversation by visiting the website nationinconversation.co.za or follow us on Twitter @NationConverse. Until next week, from me, Theo Foster, goodbye.
Nation in Conversation, proudly brought to you by AFGRI, Fort Knox, Hinterland, Monsanto, Nedbank, NWK and Senvis.
The world is changing today. The world is changing in every way. Let's stand together, put our hands together, join hands forever. We're making it better.
No matter where you are, you could be near or far away.
We're singing